We are so excited to welcome one of the most respected royal biographers there is, Ingrid Seward, to the show today. In addition to serving as editor in chief of Majesty magazine, Ingrid has also written so many books about the royal family, more than a dozen, including Prince Philip Revealed, My Husband and I about the marriage of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, The Queen's Speech, and so many others. Her latest, My Mother and I, is about the relationship between then Prince Charles and his mother, Queen Elizabeth, which comes out August 20th here in the United States. Ingrid has worked for every major TV and radio station across the world and has the unique position of knowing many members of the royal family personally and enjoys a special relationship with the royal household. So, Ingrid, we're so thrilled and honored that you are here with us today. Welcome to the show.
Well, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you. Made me sound much grander than I
Oh,
am.
please. You are a legend in the space. So please do not undersell yourself. I get the supreme honor of chatting with you. So, my first question out of the gate for you is why choose to write about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and her son, the then Prince Charles, of course, now King Charles, for your latest book? You've written about so many different topics, but why did this topic compel you?
I think I've always really been interested in royal children because I wrote a book called Royal Children years
Yes, you
ago now.
did. Yes, you did. That's
And
right.
I've always really been interested how they were brought up and how it affects their lives and therefore how it affects all of our lives in a way. And I had a lot of information um, about Charles's upbringing. And my late husband was at school with Charles at Gordonstoun,
Okay.
and uh, he had a lot of really interesting information that he'd written and written down, but it had never been used. And I just thought, well, I think this would be a very interesting book to write.
And it's a very interesting book to read. And you write in the book that Charles is more like his mother than he would admit. So, lest we forget, Charles was not just the queen's son, he was also her apprentice for over 70 years. So, for the full deep dive, listeners, grab My Mother and I when it comes out. But on a high level, what was their relationship like?
Well, obviously, as a child, I mean, Charles was her firstborn. He was adored, and she was very. I mean, she got married in November. Um, let me just think. She's born in
1947, and he was born the next
2047.
November. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I went blank for a moment there,
No,
and
that
then
happens to
then
me all the time.
then it does. Then Charles was born. I mean, in November 48. So it was she. It was a sort of really romantic baby
Mm,
and it was a boy, which of course in those days really counted,
mm.
and it was just great happiness, and she absolutely adored him. But she only really had 2 years with him before her father died,
Hmm.
and she had to, she was the heir in line, and she had to take the position of being queen, and she was very young. She was actually 26 when she became queen.
Hmm.
And I mean, she was so young. And she also had her daughter by then, Princess
Hmm.
Anne. So she's a very young mother with a very young family, and suddenly with this incredibly responsible job thrust on her. And she said she didn't really, the only thing she knew was what her father had told her.
Mm,
And so she did everything the way that her father did. And that meant really she didn't see her children much after that. She
hmm.
just saw them in the morning, and if she was lucky, in the evening. She had to actually schedule in to see them.
Well, and it, again, as you said, was such a different time. And we've talked about royal parenting on the show, how it is obviously going right now through a much needed and intense shift, especially through the parenting of the Prince and Princess of Wales. But for Charles, as you said, his nursery staff raised him. And though his was certainly a formal upbringing, you write, despite there being only 20, which this is crazy to think about, there's only 22 years between them, between Queen Elizabeth and King Charles. And these are your words, despite there being only 22 years between their births, Queen Elizabeth and King Charles had very different experiences growing up. So how so?
Well, obviously the Charles being growing up knowing he was heir to the throne.
Right.
And
Yeah, of
when
course. Yeah.
Princess Elizabeth was born, I mean, it was fully expected that her uncle,
Right.
uh, who later became the Duke of Windsor, would get married, have children, and he would reign. And this huge responsibility wouldn't really come too near her.
Mm-hmm.
So she had, um, I think, it was still very formal by today's standards. It was still hugely formal, but it wasn't as sort of intense as
Mm-hmm.
Charles's upbringing. You know, there was a lot of discussion about every single thing that Charles did had to sort of be discussed,
Mm-hmm.
and there wasn't always time for the Queen to become that involved. So she very much, left that to Prince Philip and what
Mm-hmm.
he thought would be best.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I forget that Queen Elizabeth didn't know, as you just said, that she was going to be queen until she was 10. And so she had, over half of her childhood done before she even knew that this change was going to happen in her life. And but as you said, Charles always knew that he was destined for the throne. And you write of Charles's upbringing throughout his young life, his parents were frequently away, and he was brought up to mistrust open displays of affection, even in private. In the rarefied world in which they lived, a delicate kiss on the cheek was considered acceptable, but hugging was altogether too foreign, too invasive. They were not alone. Most aristocratic families were equally distanced from their offspring. And you also write that Elizabeth loved her children and they loved her. She just did not feel the need to be demonstrative with them. So then Charles marries Diana, who's very demonstrative, even though she is aristocratic. But how did the way Charles was parented, how did that impact the way that he ultimately parented William and Harry when they were born?
Well, Diana couldn't understand the way that Charles was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
Although Diana came from an aristocratic background and an aristocratic household and was also brought up by nannies,
Mm-hmm.
um, she couldn't understand Charles's inability to be more physical, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and more emotional with his children. He was quite formal with them, but I think when they were babies, he wasn't. He was really. I think Diana had got it in her head later that Charles was this very formal parent. But when you look back and read some of the things she said, and she would find, Charles in the bath with his children, and he would be playing them with them. I think it wasn't really until Charles wrote his book with Jonathan Dimbleby, which was
Mm-hmm.
an authorized biography, in which he said that his parents were cold and never gave him any love, and all the love he had was from his grandmother. I
Mm.
think I think that was the reflection he had at that time, which was sort of in the very early 90s. So it was after he married Diana, he did that book, but that's when he talked about it. And so I think he went in and out of these feelings for his mother. And then as he got older, he realized actually what a very, very special woman she was
Mm-hmm.
and how much he admired her. But I think he always felt, probably till she was in her dotage, that he would have liked to have had more physical affection from his mother.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Diana, maybe one of the most like my jaw is on the floor moments from the book is an anecdote about Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana. And you write, the royal family never spoke about their difficulties, and if any of them had a problem, they never talked it over. They only spoke about the most trivial of things, and as a result, awkward issues were left in abeyance until it was too late. The late Diana, Princess of Wales, was the only exception to this. And then, so when it came to Diana, her daughter-in-law, who used to complain to the Queen about how Charles hated her, which is just an awkward position for everybody. You write, not surprisingly, the Queen had no idea what to do. Emotional confrontation of this sort was totally alien to someone whose upbringing insisted that manners were more important than feelings. So how did the Queen handle this relationship? Because I think that it's been portrayed that they didn't get along, and I don't think that's true. I think that Diana really loved the Queen, but they just, again, the emotional differences. So what was that relationship like?
Well, I don't think Diana loved the Queen. I think she really respected her
Got it.
and
Okay.
and liked her. And she was, I mean, Diana was quite brave, really, in that no one had ever spoken to the Queen like Diana spoke to the Queen. I mean,
Hmm.
Diana would almost run into the Queen's audience room um, when the Queen, in between audiences. So the Queen might have been talking to the Prime Minister, for instance. Probably not, but she would have had one of these many, many audiences they have, and they would have left. And Diana would be waiting next door in what's called the pages vestibule. And the
Hmm.
minute the minister or whoever it was had been with the Queen left, she'd rush in. So she was very brave to do that. And the Queen was a bit back-footed by that. And then
Mm.
she'd say, "Oh, Mama, Mama, everybody hates me," and burst into tears.
I mean, what do
And
you do with that? That's
what
difficult.
do you? I
Even as
mean,
someone like
that's
me who has a pretty good handle on my emotions, that's tough. That's really tough, you know?
of course the Queen hadn't a clue what to do because no
Sure.
one had ever done this to her before, and she would sort of she just was nonplussed and probably didn't say very much. Um,
Yeah.
she would try and calm Diana down, um, and she worried about it. Then Diana had to go because somebody else came in, and the Queen would actually put it to the back of her mind because she just did not know what to do.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think if she had addressed this situation sooner, maybe uh, things would have been slightly different. And
Mm.
if she'd actually just said, "No, come on, Diana," and sort of uh, there's only one Prince of Wales, and you're the Princess of Wales, and you've just got to put up with it. But the Queen didn't. She didn't even go there,
Mm-hmm.
not at the beginning. And I think Philip used to say she sat on the fence about it, which she did,
Mm-hmm.
because she didn't know which side of the fence to go on.
Well, that's tough on I mean, even again, even if you are incredibly in touch with your emotions, that's tough because that's your daughter-in-law. You don't want to betray your son. There's the whole other royal politics issue of the it's just the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, any in-law relationship is tricky anyway, as many people know, and it's just made so much more complicated with the royal household in the background. And I want to talk about Philip though, because you just brought him up in passing. And the book writes about a great many people who shaped Charles into the man he is today, not the least of which was his father, Prince Philip. So you write that Charles and his father were so totally opposite that they never completely trusted one another. Prince Philip was brought up in a world run almost entirely by men. I found this interesting, Ingrid. And Charles was brought up in a world run almost entirely by women. Charles was forever trying to please his father, but had a perverse knack of doing exactly the opposite. And you also write fascinatingly that Charles loved his father, but I'm not sure he ever liked him. That is an astute observation. So, what was Philip's influence over Charles's life, for better or worse?
Well, I think that Philip wanted Charles to be a sort of mini me, if you like.
Yeah.
He wanted Charles to be tough and sporty and brave and do reckless things. And there's little boys that usually want they're very very sweet and gentle and loving, or they're reckless, aren't they? They want to test themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Charles was one of the careful ones, and he wouldn't he might climb up a climbing frame, but he wouldn't jump off it because he knew that if he jumped off it, he might injure himself. He thought about things very much. And Philip was much more of an instant person. Um, Although, obviously, as an older person, Philip thought about everything very carefully, but he used his instincts. And I think that Charles didn't really use his instincts. He was just very, very careful. And maybe this is, a reflection of being brought up by so many women.
Mm-hmm.
So careful, careful, Charles, and he was just a charming, sweet little boy, but he wasn't particularly rumbustious or brave, which is what Philip wanted him to be.
Right. I mean, how many that's just a story tale as old as time. Like how many of us just how many parents put their expectations on their children and that's just not who their child is. And that this book is great for so many reasons, but it makes the royal family more relatable than ever, I think, because these are issues that, like, with in-laws and with parents putting expectations on kids that they can't meet. And I mean, these are issues that all of us face in our families. And I also want to talk about the now Queen Camilla. I found this interesting. So you write that the Queen, meaning Queen Elizabeth, was far wiser about her son, of course, meaning Charles, than he ever gave her credit for. And she, Queen Elizabeth, was acutely aware of his strengths and weaknesses. She privately acknowledged long before anyone else that his marriage to Camilla was inevitable and that they would have to stop playing what she called this cat and mouse game and get on with it. She knew it would be the making of him as a man and eventually as king. So it sounds like the late Queen Elizabeth had really at least positive thoughts towards Camilla in the way that she related to Charles. So what were the late Queen's true thoughts on the then Camilla Parker Bowles and then later Camilla Duchess of Cornwall after they married in 2005?
Well, I think the Queen called Camilla once this much maligned woman because she'd known the Parker Bowles family all her life. The Queen
Mm-hmm.
mother's one of her closest friends was Andrew Parker Bowles's father.
Mm.
So, and they were horsey racing people. So, and they used to go and stay with the Queen Mother at Burke Hall a lot, Andrew and Camilla. And so they'd been on the periphery of the royal family for many years. And Queen really liked Camilla, but she did not condone when she discovered about Charles's relationship with Camilla. She did not condone it. I mean, she was not happy at all. You can imagine a mother-in-law wouldn't be, and she had to just cut Camilla socially. She just didn't even talk about her, and she certainly didn't see her for that whole period until after the death of Diana. Um, the Queen knew that Charles would, he needed someone. She always thought that maybe Princess Anne could be at his side, and if Camilla hadn't been in Charles's life, maybe his sister would have been at his side when he eventually, became king. But I think that the Queen realized more and more that Camilla was an amazing companion for her son, who
Mm-hmm.
she still thought lacked in various strengths, and he was Charles has sort of always looked on the black side of things, and Camilla always looked on the happy side of life. And being in Charles's position is difficult. It's not necessarily a barrel of laughs, as we call it.
Mm-hmm.
And Camilla just lightened up his life and made things that were terribly boring before really good fun. And Charles was his character was lightened up by Camilla, and the Queen saw this.
And
And she said, she thought that, he needed a strong woman at his side.
mhm.
And she was definitely the woman that would fill that role.
So as we start to close our time together, I want to talk about both sides of the coin with Charles and his mother. So there's the personal side, but there's also, I guess, lack of a better term, the professional side, the business side of their relationship. I want to start with their personal relationship as mother and son. You write, over the years, Charles and his mother mended their relationship, and it became one of mutual respect. Like many of us, once Charles has time to reflect on his relationships, he sees things in a different way. So, towards the end of her life, let's say the last 2 or 3 years of Queen Elizabeth's life, how was the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and then Prince Charles?
I think it was very close. I think,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, Charles is probably better with older people. He felt nurturing, and he wanted to protect his mother as she became older and then eventually frailer. And he saw, what she'd had to give up to fulfill her role in the way that she thought she should. And he completely sympathized with the fact that she'd really had to give him up as a child
Mm.
because she was so young. And it was, in the 50s, it was such a man's world. And here was this sort of beautiful young woman entering it, which made it even more difficult. And I think Charles determined when William got married, he said to him, I don't want you to start doing royal duty straight away. You've got to enjoy your wife and eventually your family. You've
Mm-hmm.
absolutely got to. And I'm going to insist that you do, because that's one thing that, again, Charles wasn't able to do. He didn't spend enough time with Diana and his children, and he was
Mm-hmm.
determined that William shouldn't suffer the same fate.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest takeaways I have from this book is that every generation, the royal family is not perfect, obviously, nor is any family, but they seem to learn from the mistakes of the past pretty well. And I mean, you just see the royal parenting line get stronger and stronger. I mean, the way that William and Catherine are parenting their children, I think, I mean, that's one of the best examples of parenting I've seen, and they're in the spotlight to boot. And so I really think that they're able to be nimble and learn, which I think is a very good skill. But on the other side of the coin, so I want to talk about Queen Elizabeth and then Prince Charles professionally. So you write that Charles realizes that as monarch, his mother, I mean, anybody could realize this. His mother is a very hard act to follow. He has to do the job in his own style. And you also write that in the end, Charles earned the love and support that he craved all his life. He will not let her down. And I don't think that he is nearly 2 years into the job. So, how is the king simultaneously honoring her historic 70 years on the throne while also carving his own path as monarch?
Well, he's honoring his mother by doing many, many things the same way. He's kept up all the traditions that she loved, which are so important to the sort of historical side of the monarchy. Like, for instance, we have tomorrow here, we have the state opening of Parliament with all the
Right.
pomp and circumstance. And, that will all be the same as it always was, with the late Queen. So he's keeping up the traditions, and he's keeping up the sort of historical side of things. But I think what he's done is he's much more tactile with people than the Queen ever was, because of course he's younger and he's a different generation. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, last week he met with the Indian cricket team and
Yep.
entertained them at Buckingham Palace. And this week he met with Idris Elba, and he's got, through his King's Trust, as it now is, he meets a huge number of young people. He always has done that, and that's one thing that the Queen really admired him for, was his work on the underprivileged young people of the inner cities of London, and not just London, but the inner cities of England.
Mm-hmm.
And she admired that work of his. And I think, but when you watch King Charles in a crowd, he's much more tactile, and he stretches across and shakes people's hands, and he smiles and he laughs and he jokes with them in a way which the Queen was never able to do,
Mm-hmm.
because she wasn't brought up like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Queen was incredibly funny and wonderful, but when she was in public, she was very much a queen. Whereas I
Sure.
think that Charles is very much one of the people, which I think's his different way of doing things.
Mm-hmm. I could talk to you all day. You are such a wealth of knowledge. And because of that, I'm actually wondering, I wasn't planning on asking this, but what was you've been doing this work for a long time. There's probably not a whole lot that you can learn at this point, or although maybe that's not true, but what was the most interesting piece of research or information you learned from writing My Mother and I?
I think I was really interested to learn about Camilla's early life, and I was really interested in, uh, I think, really examining the Charles's early life as well, and how it formed him.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I think the whole thing really interested me, actually, and
Yeah, it was a
and also the book's coming out in August. It's coming out in America,
yep, yep, yep. We can't
which is
wait. August
yeah,
20th, I think.
which is really good news. And I think that um, I just think the whole book really interested me. It took me quite a long time to write, because there were so many stops and starts. Because I started it way before uh, the you know the Queen died, and
Hmm.
Charles's coronation, and so I had to sort of stop it. There were so many things happening, and it was a
Hmm.
platinum jubilee, and then it sort of went on from there. And uh, I just I just love delving into how things used to be and
Hmm.
comparing them to how they are now.
Well, it was a great read. And my final question for you is when readers close the book, what do you hope they've learned about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and King Charles?
I hope that they've learned that you have to put everything in the context of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really judge the way that the Queen brought up Charles by today's standards without saying, but of course, this was 1950 and the world was such a different place. And
Yes.
it was a man's world. And women were expected to stay home and, do housework and, go to the hairdresser or whatever they did. But they weren't expected to partake in business in a way that the Queen had to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's such a great time capsule. We are so excited for you listeners to read My Mother and I for yourselves. When if you can, is it out now in the? It's out now in the UK, correct?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it came out in February in the
Okay.
UK.
Okay. We have listeners all over the world. So, UK listeners, you can already grab your copy, but US listeners, it is out August 20th here in the States. And you know what? You have done it again. It is another masterpiece. You just one after the other. And thank you so much for this book. It's so interesting and for being here today. I have loved this time with you. I know Jessica, again, regrets not being here, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. And I apologize for keeping you waiting.
Oh, you are worth the wait every time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.